Thanks for subscribing. Welcome to today's deep dive. I want you to imagine waking up in a hospital bed.
Right. Never a great start.
No, definitely not. You've got that harsh, sterile smell of antiseptic in your nose, and like four of the top orthopedic surgeons in the country are just standing over you.
Just staring down at you with a clipboard.
Yeah, and they deliver this really stark, uncompromising ultimatum. They basically say, unless we slice open your back right now and bolt a massive stainless steel Harrington rod to your shattered spine, you are going to be permanently paralyzed.
I mean, that is a terrifying reality to wake up to. The pressure to just say yes would be immense.
Oh, totally. But imagine outright rejecting that surgery, choosing instead to just lie completely still for months, attempting to heal crushed vertebrae using literally nothing but the intensely directed focus of your own consciousness.
It sounds completely impossible, like straight out of a sci-fi movie.
Right. But then imagine walking out of that hospital 9 weeks later completely healed, no surgery.
Which is wild because, I mean, the medical establishment operates so heavily on this old Newtonian paradigm, right? The idea that the body is just a mechanical machine made of discrete physical parts.
Like a car engine.
Exactly. When a gear breaks, a surgeon acts as the mechanic to physically repair or replace the hardware. So to claim that thought alone could literally reconstruct bone tissue well, that fundamentally challenges the entire foundation of traditional Western medicine.
And that structural challenge is actually the exact mission of today's deep dive. We're exploring how the immaterial human mind can literally rewire the physical brain and the physical body.
Yeah, and our guide for this whole exploration is the book Evolve Your Brain by Dr. Joe Dispenza.
And we should probably clarify right off the bat, we're just conveying the ideas and frameworks presented in his original text. We're not endorsing this as medical advice for anyone listening.
Right, absolutely. We're just reporting on the source material, and we need to establish the baseline of this text immediately because this is not, it's not a collection of positive affirmations.
No, it's super technical.
Yeah, it's a deeply biological manual operating right at the intersection of advanced neuroplasticity and quantum physics. It demands that you look at your cellular machinery not as a fixed physical destiny, but as a dynamic system responding to commands.
But before we even touch the biology of the brain, we actually have to grapple with the underlying physics that makes this whole framework even possible. Because the book's foreword is written by Amit Goswami.
The theoretical quantum physicist.
Right. And he lays out this massive paradigm shift that forces us to completely reevaluate our definition of reality.
Yeah, Goswami basically dismantles the framework most of us were taught in basic high school science. We all operate under Cartesian dualism and, classical Newtonian physics.
Where matter is the primary fundamental substance of the universe.
Exactly. In that old paradigm, consciousness is merely an epiphenomenon. It's viewed as this secondary byproduct of complex neurological activity. Like, if the brain is a biological engine, consciousness is just the invisible heat or steam radiating off of it.
It's just exhaust. It doesn't actually drive the car.
Right. It has no actual power over the engine itself.
So in that view, consciousness is just a passive passenger. But Goswami flips that entirely on its head using quantum mechanics. He introduces a model where consciousness isn't the steam, it's the primary ground of all being. The physical brain and the body are secondary.
And to understand how he arrives at that, you have to look at the behavior of subatomic particles. According to quantum mechanics, at the fundamental level of reality, objects don't exist as solid, definitive things in a fixed location.
Which is so hard to wrap your head around.
It is, because before they are observed, subatomic particles exist in a state of superposition. They are literally just waves of probability or potential. It is the act of observation, the presence of a conscious observer, that forces that wave of probability to collapse into a real, measurable physical reality.
Right, it's the observer effect. Like the famous double slit experiment where light acts like a wave until you measure it, and then suddenly, boom, it acts like a particle.
Exactly. And Goswami is taking that microphenomenon and applying it to the macrobiology of the human brain. If the physical tissues of our brain are ultimately constructed of these same subatomic particles, which exist as fields of quantum possibilities.
Wait, so our conscious attention is the force determining which of those neurological possibilities collapses into physical reality?
Yes, downward causation. That is the technical term for it. Instead of matter determining consciousness, which is upward causation, consciousness dictates the state of matter. The observing mind selects a reality from the quantum field, and the physical brain reorganizes its neural networks to reflect that choice.
Okay, let's unpack this, because discussing quantum wave collapse and downward causation is, frankly, incredibly
That
abstract.
totally gets very philosophical very
Right,
fast.
so to understand how this theory actually operates in human biology, we have to look at the visceral, physical trauma that initiated Dr. Dispenza's whole investigation. Because he didn't come up with this in a cozy lab. He was basically forced into it on an asphalt road.
Yeah, the catalyst for his entire body of research was a catastrophic accident. This was back in 1986. Dr. Dispenza was competing in a triathlon in Palm Springs.
And during the cycling portion, a police officer actually directed him to merge into a lane of traffic, right?
Yeah, and a Ford Bronco traveling at approximately 80 kilometers per hour just failed to see him. The SUV struck him from behind, catapulting him into the air, and then he just slammed down onto the pavement.
I mean, the biomechanical forces involved in an 80-kilometer-per-hour impact on a human spine are just devastating. The kinetic energy transferred into his back resulted in massive compressive fractures.
6 thoracic vertebrae, specifically T8 through T12.
We were talking about vertebrae that were essentially pancaked and completely shattered.
Yeah.
Fragments of bone were pressed tightly against his spinal cord.
And the medical imaging just painted a very grim reality. Multiple leading orthopedic surgeons reviewed his case, and they all arrived at the exact same conclusion. The structural integrity of his spinal column was destroyed.
Hence the Harrington rod surgery ultimatum.
Right. Which involves flaying the back open, attaching a long stainless steel rod to the spine with hooks and screws, and fusing the broken vertebrae with bone grafts scraped from the pelvis.
It's just a brutal, brutal surgery. And they told him that if he refused it, the sheer weight of his upper body would cause his unstable spine to collapse the second he tried to stand up. The bone fragments would sever his spinal cord, and he'd have irreversible paralysis from the chest down.
It's the ultimate test of that old Newtonian paradigm we talked about. The mechanical structure is broken, therefore it requires a mechanical intervention.
But he had a deep background in chiropractic care, neuroscience, and cellular biology, so he actually rejected the surgery.
He did. He walked away from it. Or rather, he was wheeled away from it.
I have to play devil's advocate here, though. Refusing an emergency spinal fusion when actual bone shards are pressing against your spinal cord sounds incredibly dangerous. I mean, most medical professionals would view that as reckless endangerment driven by shock or denial. How does the book differentiate between targeted biological reprogramming and a patient just suffering from blind delusion?
Well, the text makes a crucial distinction between passive wishful thinking and active, rigorous biological engagement. Dispenza wasn't ignoring his injuries or relying on, empty hope. He hypothesized that the body possesses an innate intelligence.
Like the autonomic nervous system.
Exactly. Think about it. Right now, without conscious effort, a deeply complex intelligence is regulating your heart rate, filtering blood through your kidneys, organizing billions of chemical reactions per second. Dispenza reasoned that this underlying intelligence is the biological manifestation of that primary consciousness Goswami described.
So his theory was that the same cellular intelligence that constantly builds and maintains the body could be consciously directed to repair the massive trauma, as long as he could communicate with it clearly.
Right. He theorized that if he could bypass his conscious fears and directly interface with this autonomic intelligence, he could essentially hand it a precise blueprint for healing. He knew that bone remodeling is driven by specialized cells called osteoblasts.
So he just needed to direct the osteoblasts to the fracture sites.
Yes, through highly focused mental observation.
And the protocol he developed to do this was just agonizingly rigorous. He checks himself out of the hospital, goes to a friend's house, and for 3 straight months, he lays completely immobilized in a bright room.
And for 3 hours every single day, morning, noon, and night, he guided himself into profound states of self-hypnosis and meditation.
Which is where we really see the concept of the quantum observer effect put into biological practice.
Right.
Absolutely. During those 3 hours, he would use his mind's eye to visually reconstruct his spine. He didn't just generally wish for health, he mentally rebuilt each individual vertebra, visualizing the cellular scaffolding forming, the calcium and phosphorus depositing.
So instead of treating his body like a broken machine that needed a mechanic, he treated it like a biological 3D printer, and he was just feeding it new software code.
That is a perfect analogy, yes. He was acting as the architect, handing exact blueprints to the cellular construction crew. And the mental discipline required for this was absolute.
because the text notes that if his focus drifted for even a fraction of a second, if he pictured a wheelchair or felt a spike of terror or doubted the process, he would immediately stop the meditation.
He forced himself to start over from the very beginning. Every time.
That sounds exhausting.
It was. But he demanded perfection from his conscious observation until he could hold a crystal clear, joyful image of a fully healed spine for the entire session. He was relentlessly collapsing the quantum wave of a healed spine while refusing to give any observational energy to the wave of paralysis.
And the results were just unreal. 9.5 weeks after the accident, he was walking. He actually returned to his clinic and began seeing patients again.
No body cast, no surgery, no paralysis.
At 12 weeks, he was back in a gym lifting weights.
What's fascinating here is the measurable biological outcome of this intense cognitive focus. We aren't just talking about subjective well-being or pain management. He achieved profound structural regeneration.
And during his recovery, he made a vow, didn't he?
Yeah, he promised that if he successfully directed his biology to heal his spine, he would dedicate his life to researching the science of spontaneous healing, and he completely rejected the term miracle.
Because a miracle implies a random, mystical event outside the laws of nature.
Exactly. To him, this was a replicable neurobiological mechanism. He proved that the physical hardware of the body is subservient to the software of the mind.
Okay, so he fed his body new software code to reconstruct bone tissue. But if we all possess this underlying cellular intelligence, where exactly is the keyboard? Like, how does the physical tissue of our brain actually process that abstract conscious code and translate it into biological action?
To answer that, we have to dig into the literal architecture of the mind. The book explains that the brain isn't just one uniform blob of tissue, it's essentially an evolutionary dig site.
Right, the triune brain model. Dispenza breaks this down into the 3 brains. Let's walk through those. At the base of the skull, we have the first brain, which is primarily the cerebellum and the brainstem.
Which is ancient, roughly 300 to 500 million years old.
It's the autopilot. It handles the baseline physiological functions that keep us alive without us having to think about them.
Yeah, the cerebellum regulates autonomic processes, balance, and highly coordinated subconscious motor behaviors. And then, layered directly on top of that base, we find the midbrain, or the limbic system.
The mammalian brain.
Right, which developed to ensure our survival in a hostile, unpredictable environment.
The limbic system is the chemical factory. It houses the amygdala and the hypothalamus, right?
It is entirely reactionary. It processes sensory information and compares it against a library of past experiences and genetic hardwiring. If it perceives a threat, the amygdala instantaneously signals the hypothalamus to trigger the sympathetic nervous system.
It just floods the body with stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline for that fight or flight response.
Exactly. It operates entirely on reflex and chemical association.
Now, since you listeners probably already know the basic mechanics of how cortisol initiates a stress cascade, what we really need to focus on is the layer sitting above that primitive alarm system. Because if the midbrain had been running the show while Dr. Dispenza was lying in that bed, he would have been consumed by a chemical storm of pure terror and panic.
He would have never been able to focus.
Right. But he wasn't panicking, because he utilized the crowning achievement of human evolution, the neocortex.
The neocortex is that thick, deeply grooved outer layer of the brain. It's the newest addition, only about 3 million years old. It handles our complex sensory processing, spatial reasoning, and conscious thought.
Here's where it gets really interesting. Because within the neocortex, there is a specialized region that holds the key to overriding our hardwired biology. The book points to the frontal lobe as the absolute master controller.
Located right behind your forehead, the frontal lobe acts as the CEO, the executive director, or the conductor of the neurological symphony.
So what makes it so powerful?
Well, the prefrontal cortex, specifically the dorsolateral prefrontal cortex, is the seat of executive function. It grants us working memory, the ability to plan for the future, and the capacity for sustained, focused attention. But its most critical function, at least in the context of rewiring the brain, is its inhibitory control over the limbic system.
So while the midbrain is screaming threat, panic, react, the frontal lobe has the neurological authority to step in and say, stand down.
It physically sends inhibitory neural projections, GABAergic signals, down into the amygdala to suppress the stress response. When you utilize your frontal lobe to intently focus on a single thought or intention, you are engaging an executive override. You are choosing a response rather than defaulting to an evolutionary reflex.
Which is literally the biological manifestation of free will. So, for you listening right now, the book suggests thinking of your frontal lobe as a master volume dial. When you actively engage it, when you lock your attention entirely onto a vision of a healed body or a new skill or a future goal, you are literally turning down the neurological volume of your midbrain's survival instincts.
You quiet the sensory input from the external environment, you silence the memories of past traumas, and you allow your consciousness to exist purely in the realm of intention.
And sustained intention is the catalyst for structural change. If the frontal lobe can hold a thought with enough intensity, it begins to manipulate the physical architecture of the neocortex. It initiates neuroplasticity.
And we really need to dismantle a deeply ingrained myth right now. For decades, the scientific consensus was neurorigidity, the belief that once you reached adulthood, your brain was just a static, hardwired machine.
Like you had a fixed number of neurons, they slowly died off, and your personality and emotional baselines were just locked in concrete forever.
That Newtonian view of a static brain has been entirely debunked. The current paradigm is neuroplasticity. The human brain is a highly malleable dynamic matrix. It possesses the inherent biological ability to break apart old neural connections and forge entirely new circuits at any point in your life, regardless of age or genetics.
To understand how the brain physically rewires itself, the book leans heavily on Donald Hebb's 1949 model of Hebbian learning. It's usually summarized by that famous axiom, neurons that fire together, wire together.
It sounds like a catchy slogan, but the cellular mechanics behind it are profound. When we introduce a new thought or behavior, we are activating a weak neural signal. To make that signal stick, the brain relies on the principle of association. It links the new, weak network to a robust, pre-existing neural network.
So like if you're trying to learn a complex new physical skill, your brain fires the new neurons simultaneously with the established neurons that already govern your basic motor control.
Exactly, but it's not just a momentary electrical spark. Through repeated, focused attention driven by the frontal lobe, the brain undergoes a process called long-term potentiation, or LTP. When two neurons repeatedly fire across a synapse, the biology of the cells physically alters to make future communication easier and faster.
Right, it's not just biological glue. What is actually happening at the synaptic cleft during LTP? Let's get into the weeds.
Okay, so when the presynaptic neuron fires repeatedly, it releases a flood of the neurotransmitter glutamate. This intense firing forces the postsynaptic neuron to open specialized channels called NMDA receptors.
Okay, got it.
And these receptors allow calcium ions to rush into the receiving cell. That influx of calcium triggers a massive chemical cascade that reaches all the way into the nucleus of the neuron, activating specific genes.
Wow, so it's sending a signal straight to the DNA.
Yes, the DNA responds by synthesizing new proteins, which are then used to build new structural components. The receiving neuron literally sprouts new dendritic spines, actual physical branches reaching out to strengthen the connection.
The synaptic gap narrows, and the number of receptors increases. You are physically thickening the wiring of the brain. The habit moves from being a temporary electrical pattern to a permanent hardware installation.
Which is incredible on its own.
But the most staggering revelation in Dr. Dispenza's text is how we can trigger this physical rewiring without ever lifting a finger. We don't actually require external physical experience to induce long-term potentiation. There is a study he references from the 1955 Journal of Neurophysiology that totally redefines the boundary between imagination and reality.
Oh, the piano study, yes.
Break down how they actually prove this in a clinical setting, because it's wild.
So the study investigated the neurological effects of purely mental rehearsal. The researchers divided subjects into groups. One group was instructed to physically practice a specific, complex sequence of finger movements on a keyboard for several hours a day.
Pretty standard practice.
Right. But the other group was instructed to merely sit in a chair and mentally rehearse the exact same finger movements with intense focus. They were monitored with electromyography to ensure not a single muscle fiber in their hands actually contracted.
So they were completely physically inert, just sitting there.
Completely. But when the researchers mapped the subjects' brains afterward, the results were astonishing. The individuals who only mentally rehearsed the movements exhibited the exact same significant structural changes in their motor cortex as the subjects who physically practiced the movements.
The brain had physically built the neurological hardware to support a skill the body had never actually performed. That blows my mind.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, the biological truth is astounding. The brain does not possess the capacity to distinguish between an intense mental visualization occurring entirely within your frontal lobe and a physical experience occurring in your external environment. Chemically and structurally, they are processed as the exact same event.
The implications for physical therapy alone are massive. The book notes that this exact principle is used in modern stroke rehabilitation. Patients suffering from partial paralysis will engage in intense mental imagery, visualizing themselves moving their paralyzed limbs. Because they are forcing the neurons to fire together in their minds, they induce cortical remapping. They bypass the damaged tissue and restore actual physical mobility.
You are literally laying the biological tracks for a new reality.
Which means your brain doesn't just record reality as it happens, it can be programmed to anticipate it. By combining a clear intention orchestrated by your frontal lobe with an elevated emotional state, you force your neurons to fire in new sequences. You physically upgrade your neurological hardware before the physical event even takes place.
Yeah, you become the creator of your brain's architecture, not just a victim of its past.
Okay, hold on. If the science is this clear, if neuroplasticity means we just have to visualize what we want and our brain automatically builds the circuits for it, why is human change so agonizingly difficult? Why do people spend decades locked in chronic anxiety, explosive anger, or deep depression, even when they consciously want to change?
Because we're dealing with more than just the brain's circuitry, we have to address the body. While the neocortex is incredibly plastic and ready to wire new futures, the physical body has often become a rigid chemical prison. We must examine how thoughts translate into biological matter.
Let's trace the life cycle of a thought then. A thought is not an ephemeral cloud floating in your skull. It is a distinct electrical impulse traveling through a neural network. And when that circuit fires, it signals the limbic system, specifically the hypothalamus, to act as a chemical manufacturing plant.
Exactly. The hypothalamus translates the electrical language of the brain into the chemical language of the body. If you generate a joyful, loving thought, your brain produces specific neurotransmitters and neuropeptides that correspond to joy. These chemicals are released into the pituitary gland and flushed into the bloodstream, circulating to every cell in your body.
And conversely, if you are dwelling on a bitter resentment or panicking about a future deadline, the hypothalamus creates a distinctly different batch of neuropeptides, the chemicals of anger or anxiety.
Yeah.
The brain matches the chemical precisely to the thought.
And then the body physically experiences the feeling of that thought. Emotion is simply the biological consequence of a thought. But the communication doesn't end there. The brain is constantly monitoring the chemical state of the body.
Right, it's a two-way street.
When the brain detects a massive influx of stress chemicals, it adjusts its cognitive state to match the body's physical state. It essentially says, the body is angry, therefore, I must generate more angry thoughts.
It forms a closed feedback loop. The thought creates the emotion, the body feels the emotion, and the body's chemical state drives the brain to fire the exact same thoughts again. You think about an argument, your body gets flooded with adrenaline, your brain senses the adrenaline, so it brings up 5 more reasons you should be angry at that person.
And if you run this biological loop for years or decades, a profound and dangerous shift occurs. The body literally becomes the mind. The conscious control of the frontal lobe is bypassed entirely. You are operating on a subconscious chemical autopilot, where your reality is just a biological echo of your past experiences.
The book uses a mechanism to explain this that is chilling. It draws a direct parallel between our emotional states and severe drug addiction, focusing on a cellular process called receptor downregulation.
It is the exact same mechanism. Consider a substance abuse disorder, like heroin addiction. When a user introduces heroin, it floods their cellular receptors with overwhelming stimulation. To protect itself from the toxic overload, the cell physically alters its membrane. It reduces the number of active receptor sites.
This is downregulation.
Right. And consequently, the user requires a massive increase in the drug just to achieve a baseline feeling of normalcy because they have fewer receptors to absorb it. They've built a tolerance.
But dispenza is arguing that our cells do this with our own internally generated emotional chemicals.
Yes. Every cell in your body has thousands of receptors on its exterior. If you have spent 10 years locked in a state of chronic stress, anxiety, or victimhood, you have relentlessly bombarded your cells with high doses of cortisol and specific stress neuropeptides. To adapt to the toxic environment, your cells downregulate their receptors for those specific emotions.
Which means just to feel a baseline state of normal, your physical cells now require a highly elevated dose of anxiety or anger.
Your cells literally become dependent on the chemical cocktail of suffering. We develop a biological addiction to our own negative emotions.
This explains so much irrational human behavior. We subconsciously seek out conflict to get our fix. We pick an unnecessary argument with a spouse. We doom scroll through infuriating news, or we obsessively recall a past trauma, not because we rationally enjoy being miserable, but because the cells in our body are screaming for their daily chemical hit of anger just to feel alive.
It is cellular dependency. The body has memorized the emotion so thoroughly that the emotional state has become a subconscious biological program.
So let's say someone has a sudden realization. They use their frontal lobe, they put their foot down, and they declare, I am done being angry. I'm going to be a patient, peaceful person starting right now. What actually happens in the body? Are you saying they literally go through chemical withdrawal?
A literal physiological withdrawal. The moment you use your frontal lobe to stop generating the familiar thoughts of anger, the hypothalamus stops producing the corresponding neuropeptides. The cells in your body, which are addicted to that chemical rush, suddenly experience a deficit. They sound an immediate biological alarm.
The cells are basically saying, where is our anger? We need our fix.
The body sends urgent afferent signals up the spinal cord, straight through the vagus nerve, directly into the brain. The body begins demanding that the brain return to its habitual state. It forces the brain to generate thoughts that will trigger the release of the missing chemicals.
That inner voice, when you're trying to diet or meditate or stay calm, and that voice creeps in saying, this is too hard, or just get mad, they deserve it. Or you can start being peaceful tomorrow. We usually assume that is our mind being weak. But what you're describing is the physical body throwing a biological tantrum. It's the body trying to manipulate the brain into supplying its drug of choice.
Exactly. And recognizing that biological mechanism is the most critical step in personal transformation. When you feel that immense psychological friction, it is not a lack of willpower. It is the feeling of cellular withdrawal. Breaking that chemical loop is the most agonizing phase of rewiring your life.
Because the body is fighting back.
It requires the frontal lobe to firmly step in, acknowledge the body's demands, and relentlessly override them. The frontal lobe has to act as the architect, refusing to change the blueprint just because the construction crew is complaining.
And navigating that exact transition from being a prisoner of the body's past chemical addictions to becoming the master of your neurological future is the focus of the final masterclass in the book. Dr. Dispenza breaks down the journey of true transformation into a specific biological progression.
He adapts the psychological model of the 4 stages of competence. To briefly summarize the original model, it begins with unconscious incompetence, where you don't even know you're doing something wrong. Then conscious incompetence, where you recognize your flaws. Then conscious competence, where you can execute a new behavior, but it requires immense, exhausting focus. And finally, unconscious competence, where the new behavior is completely automatic.
And Dispenza maps this onto our biology in 3 crucial phases: thinking, doing, and being. Let's dissect those. The first stage is thinking. This is where most people are when they consume information, when they read Evolve Your Brain or listen to this deep dive. We are acquiring semantic memory. We are gathering intellectual, philosophical data about who we want to become.
Right. During the thinking phase, we are activating the frontal lobe. We are engaging in mental rehearsal, visualizing new reactions and new scenarios. And as we establish with Hebbian learning, this mental practice does begin to physically assemble new neural networks. We are installing new potential hardware in the neocortex.
But the text is very clear that stopping at the thinking stage is a massive trap.
Yeah.
You can read a library of books on how to be compassionate. Your frontal lobe might perfectly wire the intellectual concept of compassion, but it remains purely philosophical. Your body, the chemical laboratory, hasn't experienced it yet. The biology hasn't shifted.
It's all just theory at that point.
To bridge that immense gap between mind and body, you have to force yourself into the second stage.
And doing is where the actual biological crucible occurs. This is the practical application of your semantic memory into your physical environment. You must take the intellectual concept and execute it.
So like when you are presented with a highly stressful situation, and you actively use your frontal lobe to suppress your midbrain's reflex to scream, and instead you intentionally choose to speak with patience.
Yes, you are creating a brand new physical experience.
And as we covered, physical experiences produce emotions. So instead of your body receiving its habitual chemical hit of cortisol and angry neuropeptides, your new behavior forces the brain to release a completely different chemical cocktail. You flood the body with the chemistry of patience and resolution.
You are creating an episodic memory. The doing stage forces the body to biologically understand what the mind has only learned intellectually. For the first time, your physical behavior is perfectly aligned with your conscious intentions. The brain and the body are receiving the exact same chemical messaging. You are actively breaking the old eviction loop and initiating epigenetic changes within the cells.
It's the difference between memorizing the aerodynamic physics of riding a bicycle and actually sitting on the seat, pushing the pedals, and letting your nervous system feel the balance. But the doing stage is still exhausting, right? Because it is conscious competence. You still have to exert massive effort to try to be patient. You are still fighting the withdrawal symptoms. How does the book define the finish line? How do we know when we've pushed through the friction and reached the final stage being?
You enter the state of being unconscious competence when the new neural network is so robustly wired and the body is so chemically adapted to the new neuropeptides that the behavior no longer requires any conscious effort from the frontal lobe. The semantic memory and the episodic memory have fused into procedural memory, often stored deep in the cerebellum.
It has become an absolute reflex.
The mind and body are in total unified alignment. To borrow the famous Nike slogan the book references, you just do it. In the state of being, you don't have to constantly monitor your thoughts to suppress anger. You don't have to convince yourself to be patient. You simply are patient. It is your default biological baseline.
That is incredible.
The intense neuroplasticity has finalized the new circuit. And through a process called synaptic pruning, the brain has dismantled the old neural networks of anger due to lack of use. This raises an important question. How often do we, as a culture, trap ourselves entirely in the thinking stage?
Oh, all the time. Yeah. We listen to endless deep dives. We buy the self-help books. We stockpile vast amounts of semantic memory about how to optimize our lives. We have all the intellectual knowledge, and yet we look around and realize our lives haven't changed one bit.
It is the great deception of the modern information age. We confuse intellectual comprehension with biological transformation. They are not the same. Transformation only occurs when you possess the mental fortitude to push through the agonizing chemical withdrawal of your own body. You have to force the body out of its addiction to the past, endure the intense discomfort of the doing stage, and relentlessly repeat it until the new hardware is permanently installed as your state of being.
Which brings us full circle to Dr. Dispenza, lying completely immobilized in that hospital bed. He didn't just casually think about a healed spine while letting his mind wander to his fears. He engaged his frontal lobe to forcefully direct his cellular intelligence. He endured the intense, daily exhausting effort of mental rehearsal until his body structurally and chemically aligned with the blueprint in his mind.
He didn't just wish for a new reality, he biologically forced himself into a new state of being.
He weaponized the exact physiological mechanisms we've explored. He utilized his dorsolateral prefrontal cortex to completely override the panic of his limbic system. He utilized Hebbian learning and long-term potentiation to construct a new neurological reality. And most importantly, he adamantly refused to let the broken, mechanical reality of his present body dictate the vision of his future.
It's just a masterclass in human potential.
We have covered a massive amount of complex biological territory today. We started by dismantling the Newtonian view of the body, recognizing through quantum physics that our consciousness sits firmly in the driver's seat of reality. We explored the deep archaeology of the brain, identifying how the primitive midbrain keeps us trapped in survival loops, but how the frontal lobe serves as the ultimate CEO, capable of executive override.
We examine the molecular mechanics of neuroplasticity, how intense mental rehearsal triggers calcium influxes, gene expression, and structural changes in the neocortex, proving that the brain wires physical hardware regardless of whether an experience is real or vividly imagined.
And we faced the uncomfortable biological reality of emotional addiction, how our cells physically downregulate their receptors, trapping us in a chemical prison of our own past traumas. But we also charted the grueling necessary path out, moving from the intellectual safety of thinking through the biological friction of doing until we forged an entirely new neurological baseline of being. Your brain is not fixed. It is an infinitely malleable matrix, and you possess the exact same biological machinery that Dr. Dispenza used to reconstruct his shattered spine.
The underlying truth of all this science is that the plasticity of the human brain never ceases. At any age, under any circumstance, you retain the neurological authority to rewire your physiological reality.
So what does this all mean for you? We want to leave you with a concept derived directly from the intersection of this neuroscience and quantum theory. If the clinical data on neuroplasticity proves that your brain cannot chemically differentiate between a real experience and a profoundly imagined one, it means you possess the power to literally install the neurological hardware of an experience before that experience ever physically manifests in your life.
It completely redefines the function of the brain. The brain is no longer merely an organic hard drive recording the history of your past traumas and habitual reactions. If you commit to the rigorous mastery of your frontal lobe and elevate your emotional state, your physical brain transforms. It literally becomes a map of your future.
The metaphorical X-ray machine isn't looking at what is broken or hardwired anymore. It is illuminating exactly what you are choosing to build. The only question left to answer is, what future are you currently mapping in your mind?